Hello, my little cubs. I'm your host, Professor Nicktimus Beastly, and welcome to Wolf Moon Cinema Toy Reviews. Today, we look at an action figure line that began over 40 years ago and inspired a generation to reach for the stars. Oh, no, we're not talking about those. We're talking about Mattel's Battlestar Galactica action figure line. So, after the phenomenal success of Star Wars, ABC TV was willing to greenlight their own science fantasy show, Battlestar Galactica, or as I like to sometimes call it, Mormons in Space! I don't have time to go into it, but just look it up on the internet. Anyway, so of course, to compete with Kenner's Star Wars action figure line, which had become a phenomenon, Mattel Toys decided that they had to scoop this license. Now, in a weird bit of merchandising, there were action figures produced and vehicles. But the vehicles and the action figures are not compatible. The vehicles, seen here, included small micro-figures that are posable and do fit inside. The action figure line at 3/4 inch, the same size as Star Wars figures, do not fit in the vehicles, combined with the fact that the action figure packaging even calls out that they're not for use with the vehicles. I have no idea how this happened. My only thought is that the vehicles were probably in development before the action figures, and once Kenner's Star Wars action figures became popular, they scrambled to have an equivalent. Also, the starships, which is not the topic of our review today, but the starships are very important in action figure history. The initial releases had firing missiles that unfortunately led to the death of a small child. This created a shockwave throughout the toy industry. To be honest, I have no idea how Mattel's Battlestar Galactica line could possibly have failed the retail market. But, getting back to the action figure line, these figures were released in 1979. There were two series of figures. The first 6 are fairly common, the second 4 are extremely rare. Despite what some information on the internet will give you, all of these figures were actually released in 1979. The first 6 earlier in the year, the last 4 later in the year. The action figure line began with 6 figures in early 1979. These were Lieutenant Starbuck, Commander Adama, a figure referred to as Daggett, although the character is Muffet too, the Imperious Leader, a Silver Cylon Centurion, and an Ovion. The second series, that was released later in 1979, included Baltar, Lucifer, a Gold Cylon Commander, and a Bore. The first figure we'll look at is Lieutenant Starbuck. One thing that's interesting about this line is, despite including 10 action figures, they did not produce Apollo, who was arguably the main character of the series rather than Starbuck. Essentially, it's rather like producing Han Solo and not Luke Skywalker. The Starbuck action figure actually sports a very good likeness to actor Dirk Benedict. Unfortunately, there are no paint details on the face, which somewhat harms the design of the figure. In fact, these Battlestar Galactica figures have many of the same problems that most of Mattel's lines from the late 70s and early 80s suffer from. An incessant economy of reusing parts, bizarre character choices, and unwillingness to produce any female characters combined with an overemphasis on villains. In fact, many of these problems which plagued the Battlestar Galactica figures, the products that were produced for Clash of the Titans, and the products they produced for Flash Gordon have these same issues. It really wouldn't be until Masters of the Universe began in '82 that they solved these problems by producing more heroes, having female characters in the line. So I think this may be a sign of the issues they were having at the time developing a boys action figure franchise. He includes both a cape and laser pistol. The laser pistol is extremely tiny and very easily lost. Next is Commander Adama. He shares an identical body and laser pistol to Starbuck. and his cape is a different color but came from the same pattern. Again, a very good likeness to Lord Green, unfortunately marred by a lack of paint details. You can also see here the card back and card style used for the line with very attractive artwork. One thing that can be said about Mattel's lines from this era is that the packaging is quite good. Next up among the first series heroes is a figure dubbed Daggett, although technically the character is Muffet too. Daggets are either the colonial word for dog or an animal that very much looks like a dog. So Muffet 2, seen here, is a robotic dog who was in fact played by a chimpanzee on set. There is a variant on this figure. Mine has the more orange fur, which is right to the series. Some were released with a more tan fur. He's actually a very well sculpted figure, possibly one of the best sculpted and most accurate figures of the first series. One should be very careful with the tail. It's made from a very thin plastic and can easily be broken. Next, we move on to the first series villains, starting with the Imperious Leader. Now, the Imperious Leader is perhaps the most common and least desirable figure from the first series. You see, though the Cylons are supposed to be a mechanical race, the Imperious Leader is reptilian. In the context of the show, it's because Imperious Leaders are made to look like the Imperial Cylon race, and despite being robots, they look organic. What actually happened on set was that the Cylons were supposed to be an organic species throughout filming, and actually the European cinematic releases make no mention of them being robotic. And also, they're referred to as a reptilian species in a lot of ancillary merchandise that came out at the beginning of the series. It was a last-minute decision with a little bit of throwaway dialogue added into the pilot movie when it aired on ABC that established the Cylons as being a mechanical race. The original intention was that they were a race of lizard men in armored suits, and the Imperious Leader was organic because the intention was he was simply a Cylon not wearing armor. I think that the use of soft goods on this figure was a mistake. It looks like he's wandering around his base star in a maroon caftan. The actual costume in the movie is much more impressive and is scaled. Also, what people think of as being an afro, or perhaps his brains, you see, high-ranking Cylons are supposed to have 3 brains, is in fact neither of the above. It's actually a hood. And in the series, if you watch very closely, you can actually see that as the Imperious Leader moves his head, the large coral-like glittery structure above his head doesn't move. In fact, it's like a hood or a headdress. But on the figure, it is glued on. However, sometimes over the years, the glue can get a little weak, and you can actually remove it from the figure, allowing you to not only remove the, we'll just call it a headdress, but also his caftan, revealing the unimpressively sculpted figure beneath. I think the Imperious Leader is one of the weaker figures in the line, and given the number of unsold Imperious Leaders that could be found in the mid-1980s, I think most kids of the 70s would agree with me. Next up we have the Ovions, a race of insectoids that lay their eggs inside humans and allow their larvae to eat them from the inside out. The Ovion figure is actually very well sculpted, but like a lot of figures in this line, suffers from poor paint choices, especially around the eyes. The cat-like eyes they opted to paint are inaccurate to the show. I've seen people actually repaint these Ovions to give them a more insectoid eye, which greatly improves the look of the figure. The Ovions include only one accessory, a sort of glittery material shawl, which is correct to the actual series. And last, but definitely not least, of the first series are the Silver Cylon Centurions. Easily one of the most attractive action figures of the entire late 70s. The back metallization looks fantastic, the pose is dynamic, it's a great looking figure. As we said before, the Cylons were originally supposed to be a reptilian species wearing armor. After the fact, the decision was made to make them robotic. The Cylon Centurion includes their distinctive bayoneted laser rifles, and has one major design flaw, which is that The legs are one piece. He can turn at the waist, but he cannot actually sit. Something of a design flaw. So we move on to the second series, who again were also released in 1979, just later in the year. In between the first and second series, the gold Cylon Commander was offered as a mail-away. People can confirm that the figure did ship, so there were mail-away gold Cylon Commanders. But it must be rare. You almost never see some sort of box sample turn up on eBay, which is unusual. Most Star Wars mail-away offers turn up routinely. So I get the impression that this mail-away offer was very brief. But the Cylon Commander was released in stores. So the figure comes from the exact same sculpt as the original Cylon Centurion, but adds a gold color. As you can see from my example, the gold paint on the gloves and lower boots does not hold up well and tends to flake off on almost all samples. Not to mention the fact that the gold has a tendency to fade. So on this example, while he is gold, it's not the most intense gold. So it looks a little bit more silvery. Still, he has the same advantages and disadvantages as the standard silver Cylon Centurion. Next up we have Baltar. Baltar, in fact, was actually executed by the Cylons in the original theatrical film. But, for whatever reason, the decision was made to ignore all that, refilm him getting a reprieve, and make the character, despite being a traitor to the humans and really an enemy to the Cylons too, instead they have the Imperious leader give him a base star and make him a commander of a massive force of Cylons. Because apparently he assumes that he'll be able to successfully hunt down the humans. This was all very strange and didn't make a lot of sense, but I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that John Colicos was a great actor and played Baltar brilliantly as a villain. And I think this is why Baltar in the actual series itself really becomes the primary villain, really eclipsing the Imperious leader, who, actually the first Imperious leader got killed in the pilot film. Then they, of course, elevated another Cylon to that role, and then presumably he may have gotten killed in another episode and they raised up another one. So Baltar kind of evolved into the main villain of the series. Like all the human characters, the sculpt is extremely well executed. Very much just like John Colicos. The figure has the same laser pistol as the other human characters, probably a bit inaccurate. The Cylons did have a unique type of laser rifle, and laser pistol. Also interesting is that his costume is black. It really should be green. And he does not have a cape. I think this comes down to the fact that with many of these series that Mattel produced, if the line made it to a second series, there would be a tendency to economize on the second series action figures, which probably explains why he inaccurately has the same arms and legs as Starbuck, and why he doesn't have his cape. Next up, we move on to Lucifer. So, Lucifer is an IL series Cylon. Supposedly a type of civilian Cylon that have 2 brains, as opposed to 3 like the Imperious leader, whose ranks are where the supply of Imperious leaders comes from. The idea being that when an Imperious leader is destroyed, an IL series Cylon is then modified, given an additional brain, given a new voice chip, and given an organic appearing casing, and becomes the new Imperious leader. So Lucifer was voiced by Jonathan Harris, better known to millions of fans as Dr. Zachary Smith from Lost in Space, who very much plays the character as an effete schemer. In fact, all of the IL series Cylons that appear throughout the show, such as Spectre, are played as effete schemers, all plotting their ascension to becoming the new Imperious leader. Throughout the series, Lucifer is something of Baltar's right-hand man. I personally have never really liked the IL Cylon design from the series. I felt that they simply did not look like Cylons, and really should have had a more reptilian and less human-looking face. However, the Lucifer action figure is actually quite impressive. The decision was made to mold the head in translucent blue plastic, paint the face and have glitter embedded inside the plastic, thus creating the illusion of the lights that can be seen inside Lucifer's translucent dome. It's actually a very impressive feature and very well executed. So, in a strange move, while I don't particularly like the show design for the IL series Cylons, I think Mattel did quite a good job with the figure. The final figure in the line is the Bore. They're a kind of pig-like humanoid who appear prominently in one episode as villains, but also apparently civilized Bore can be seen in the casino in the pilot movie, although these Bores wear robes. I'm not sure if the intention was that they're two different species that are both pig-like, or if they're the same species and the Bores that appear in one episode are simply a group that have gone feral. Whatever the case, this figure, perhaps more so than any other figure in the line, suffers from a dire lack of paint. There's no eye detailing and no painting of the fur, which results in the head looking like a potato. The figure also suffers from only having a twistable waist. Similar to the Cylons, he does not have movable lower legs. This figure includes a club, easily one of the most difficult loose accessories to find in the secondary market. In fact, from my own experience, I would actually argue that finding a complete Bore is the most difficult task of any figure in line from a collecting standpoint. So, my opinions on this line are that, while well sculpted, they suffer from excessive economizing and bizarre character choices, which I think ultimately doom this line. Also, the toy line only sold so long as the show was on the air. Battlestar Galactica, though it got good ratings, was an extremely expensive show to produce, combined with the fact that though the initial pilot movie is actually quite good, and a lot of the earlier episodes are fairly good, the series suffered from descending into 1970s camp. It was cancelled in 1979, then brought back for Galactica 1980, a series that, well, is almost unwatchable. While the original series definitely descended into 70s cheese, it still was fairly watchable. Galactica 1980, with the exception of one episode, is an extremely painful affair. So ultimately, I think the Battlestar Galactica action figure line was doomed from the start due to the fact that the series was ultimately doomed and that there was very little chance of anyone competing with Star Wars.